for your help. I appreciate that. Good morning. It is good to be back at Community Baptist Church. It's an honor to be invited to preach this time. I have a new vantage point. I can see all your faces. When your pastor called me up and told me she needed someone in the pulpit this Sunday, I was very eager to dust off my preaching robes and head out to Warrenville. I don't really get a chance to preach very often these days, and it does a Baptist good to get up in front of people every once in a while. So thank you for having me back. If I haven't met you yet, let me introduce myself just a little bit. I've been good friends and colleagues with your pastor for many years, and like her, I am also an ordained American Baptist minister. But unlike Pastor Annette, I do not serve in a church, believe it or not, and I rarely get afforded the opportunity to work in the context of a congregation like this one. By training, I am a chaplain. I spend most of my days in hospitals and jails, mostly, not in church. And if you don't know what a chaplain is, don't worry. I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. Basically, as a chaplain, I'm a minister deployed in spaces that are not primarily for ministry. In other words, presumably when you got up this morning on a Sunday morning and you braved the elements, and you braved the cold, and you showed up at 10:30 a.m. at Community Baptist, you came here for church. Probably. Unless you're in the wrong place, and you're trying to figure out how to sneak out the back now that the sermon has started. But where I usually work are places where people did not show up for church, but they're there anyway. Often where people are gathered not by common creed or shared religion, but by common circumstance, often the unfortunate occasion of tragedy. So normally I don't get to wear these robes. Most often I've got a lab coat and a pager, and you will find me ministering to those recovering and grieving in a hospital or a clinic. I meet with families, I talk with patients, I support staff, and I offer spiritual care to those who would welcome it. Or, if I'm not wearing a robe or a lab coat, I'm probably just wearing jeans and a hoodie usually, and I'm probably in jail, visiting with folks who are incarcerated and awaiting trial at Cook County. So, whether sitting at a patient's bedside or stepping behind the bars to be with inmates, my job is the same. If I'm doing my best work, and if I'm doing my job, it's this: to help people find some semblance of dignity, some semblance of courage when both of them feel fleeting. And if we're really lucky, my job is to help us catch a glimpse of the sacred in a place where I usually don't expect to find it. And this last part, the unexpected quality of my work as a chaplain, the hope of a chance encounter, right? The surprising appearance of God is, I think, part of what I really love about my work. The hospital wasn't built for religious experience, and we don't typically lock people up in jail to talk to a minister, but believe it or not, these things do happen there. The occasion for sacred spiritual moments, even miraculous moments, sometimes show up not by design, but by accident. And so when I consider this phenomenon of unexpected blessing, of accidental miracle, it does my chaplain heart good to see that our gospel reading today takes place in such a similar situation. Sure, some of it was planned. Maybe the good folks in Cana knew they were going to a wedding, and I'm sure maybe they already expected to have a glass of wine. But I bet none of them expected to be present for a miracle. And this miracle appears reluctantly and strangely and surprisingly without a lot of warning or fanfare. The wedding at Cana is a well-known biblical passage. If you've been reading the Bible for a minute, or maybe not even that long, you may have heard about this story. At least according to the Gospel of John, it holds a prominent place as the first of Jesus' miracles. And in addition to being number one, it holds plenty of other rich significance. It has, I think, a lot to say about hospitality, the blessing of union, the prominence and the authority of Jesus' mother Mary, the nature of jubilant celebration, the significance of wine as a sacrament, and so on. But it's also, for me anyway, a very weird miracle story, and I think that's why I like it. So let's dive deep into some of the ways the story breaks the mold from other miracle tales in our Christian Bible. In the first place, Jesus doesn't seem to be particularly interested in the miracle. When he's asked for help, he literally responds by asking, "What's that got to do with me?" He doesn't want to do it. And even when he does, because he does do it eventually, you can almost imagine him rolling his eyes and sighing loudly, passive-aggressively, when he finally acquiesces to his mother. So, number one, Jesus has an attitude. But even if you ignore his attitude, the occasion for the miracle is also bizarre, strange, weird. Most of the miracle stories that I remember are usually stories of healing, empowering the lame to walk, blessing the blind to see, casting out devils, calming storms, curing diseases. Usually there's some emergency or calamity or, some big major problem to solve. But here the problem feels trivial, mundane, or, if I'm reading Jesus' attitude properly, simply annoying. "We've run out of wine," Mary says. "So what?" Jesus replies. "What's that got to do with me?" Now, a little more biography about your preacher this morning. I have the privilege of being somewhat dismissive about this miracle, mainly because wine does not hold a special prominence in my life. It doesn't hold a lot of cultural or social impact in the way I live day to day. I don't really drink much alcohol at all, to be honest with you, and I have no particular interest in wine specifically. It just doesn't matter to me. But I know that for others it does. Wine holds a very prominent place in our cultural, symbolic, social, and religious reality. For some, it is what makes a meal with family. For others, it is an element of sacrament, a vehicle of blessing. For others, it is a source of addiction and destruction. Even though wine has no common place in my own life, it's hard to deny its power. Wars have been fought over who gets to drink at the Lord's table. And families the world over have been both brought together and torn apart over this element. But whatever it might have meant in the context of this story, in the first century, at a wedding in Cana, Jesus doesn't seem very interested in entertaining the thought. And if the story ended right here, if John, the gospel writer, put down his quill or whatever he was writing with and stopped, we'd already have enough for several sermons. Okay? We'd have plenty for reflection, we could have lots of Bible study, we'd have sources of meditation, and we'd find a whole bunch of theological problems that we could scratch our heads about. What it might mean to petition for miracles from a reluctant Savior, whether the faith of Christ commands us to carry on our ministries with glad hearts, or whether rolling our eyes will be good enough. We could try to solve the problem of what we do when we disagree with our mothers. It hasn't been solved yet. That would be a source of inspiration for this passage. But the story doesn't end with an argument between Jesus and Mary. And even when Mary circumvents Jesus' reluctance and the Christ performs a miracle anyway, the story keeps on going after that. Even more strangely, after all these events, after the strange miracle happens, rather than returning to Jesus or Mary's perspective, our narrator introduces a whole new character, a third character, an unnamed caterer. And it's the caterer who gets the last word. Now, we don't hardly know anything about this person. It's a caterer, someone who in some way was responsible for food and hospitality, but we don't know much else. We don't know if this caterer was young or old, wise or foolish, male or female, rich or poor, devoutly religious or a cold-hearted atheist. We don't know. Whoever she is, it is her pronouncement that concludes our gospel today. So I say, let's pay attention to what she says and what she does. The caterer, having no idea that a miracle just happened, right? The Bible tells us, right under her nose, in the middle of the wedding that she's catering. She has no idea where this wine came from. She just sees these jars. She doesn't know it used to be water. But she samples some of the wine and is surprised at how good it is. Not just good, but as the Inclusive Bible translates it, it's the best. The very best wine. It's the good stuff. And this is surprising to the caterer, not just because it's high quality, but because it came out last. And he says to the happy couple, usually, he takes them aside, bride, groom, usually you bring out the good stuff first. And then, when everybody's had a few, and they don't know any better, then you give them the cheap stuff. And she goes on to say, but you did it backwards. You brought out the top shelf, the best wine, even after nobody would notice if you didn't. Now, unlike with Jesus, I have a hard time imagining, in my theological imagination, what tone of voice I'm supposed to use for the caterer. When she says you did it backwards, is she scolding them? Telling them that they're poor hosts, that their etiquette is off? Is this a faux pas? Is she complimenting them, commending them, praising them for their generosity? We don't know, because that's the place where the story ends. We don't really know what her agenda was. John, cheekily writing his gospel, carefully giving and withholding precious bits of information, he just won't tell us. All we know is that Jesus, as his first miraculous act as Son of God, has turned water to wine, and according to one caterer, it ain't half bad. This is how John ends his story. He doesn't end on the miracle. He doesn't end with the relationship between Jesus and Mary. He ends with a wine tasting. And I believe that we're meant to find some wisdom there. But as is common with Jesus' parables, this story about Jesus could be received in one of several different ways. And we're not told which one is best, or which one works for us, or which one has wisdom and blessing for us this morning. So allow me to offer three options, three ways of responding to this caterer. I'll say, too, it'll be clear what my preference is. But ultimately, that's up to you. I can't make you live or believe or inhabit your faith in one way or the other. My hope is that you'll journey with me in three possible responses to the caterer's wine tasting. Okay, option number one. You ready for this? First option. We simply believe her. Jesus makes the best wine. End of story. Okay. On this reading, we trust the caterer implicitly. And the primary conclusion is about the caterer's assessment. Jesus made it, and it's the best. Not only that, but it takes time for the greatest to appear, right? After all, the caterer herself comments, usually the chief stuff, that comes out last. But here, in the coming of Christ, the greatest among us came at the end. And this fits other Jesus-y teachings in the Bible, like the first will be last and the last will be first and so on. We know that. And that plays up Jesus' exceptional quality, an overlooked quality, that the prophet that we would be quick to dismiss, maybe even crucify, hang on a tree, is actually the greatest among us. And that those who have the eyes to see and the ears to hear, and in this case the palates to taste, pay attention. Jesus has come. Jesus is Lord. Jesus is the best, symbolized by the best wine. That is the first option, I think, is to simply believe. But here's another way to go. You ready for this? Number two. We don't want to simply believe the caterer. We could instead, what's the alternative? We could be skeptical of her, right? We don't know her. We could come instead and be cynical about the wine tasting. After all, we don't know much about her or him or wherever they are. The caterer doesn't have the reputation or the credentials that Jesus or Mary have. This is just a nobody without a name, and maybe we shouldn't even take their word for it. So, in preparation for this sermon, I did some research into wine tasting, which, as I mentioned, is not really a part of my life. So it was a whole new world diving into. And let me tell you, it has its own vocabulary, its own culture, and I was really a fish out of water here. But this is what I found. And then I found a bunch of wine articles, and then I found a bunch of studies about wine tasting. And this is what I found. Some studies suggest much to the chagrin of the wine community. Okay? Some studies suggest that wine tasting, and more importantly, wine judging, is completely arbitrary. That is, the judging of wine, and therefore the rating of wine, and therefore the price on the bottle, okay, when studied by independent researchers, seems to be entirely random. Some of the most respected and highly regarded wine connoisseurs in the world apparently have trouble distinguishing good, expensive wine from low-quality, cheap wine in a blind taste test. Furthermore, expert judges, when given the same wine poured from the same bottle within minutes of each other, have been known to give wildly different scores if they are told that each glass is from a different vineyard. And finally, this one I thought was the most interesting, in some experiments, judges are given wine with an added flavorless food coloring, right? So you can kind of see where this is going, unbeknownst to them, right, obviously. So as you can imagine, wine experts also seem to have trouble telling red wines from white ones by taste alone. And if they think they're drinking a red, because somebody put a tasteless dye in it, they change their evaluation and describe the taste differently than if they imbibe the same white wine without the food coloring. Okay, so why am I bringing this up? This is a sermon, not a critique of wine culture. Okay, I'm not trying to rain on your parade if that's part of your life. But in the option of cynicism, this is a big help, right? One option in response to the caterer is to throw up our hands and decide that none of it actually matters. This nihilistic and cynical response is, at least for me, actually pretty tempting. And if you knew my personality, you would know that I tend to veer towards the skeptical, cynical side of things, often in the Bible. This, in some ways, even seems set up from Jesus' personality, because from the get-go, he wasn't really on board with the miracle in the first place. And if we know that wine tasting is an unreliable, arbitrary practice anyway, then trying to decide which wine to serve first or last, or trying to figure out which wine is the best, is just a big waste of time. Our gospel reading gives us essentially a blind taste test, right? The gospel takes great pains to explain to us that the caterer did not know what she was tasting, didn't know that Jesus had the wine ahead of time, didn't know there used to be a jar of water. We're told she's ignorant of all these things. It's a blind taste test. But as the research shows, wine tasting just can't be trusted, especially when information is hidden or altered from the judges. The whole enterprise perhaps has lost its integrity, and the caterer can be dismissed. In some way, the caterer even admits this, because he's the one that remarks that most people at weddings can't tell the difference anyway. It doesn't really matter which wine you serve, because after a while, no one's palate is good enough. That's why you go for the cheap stuff when nobody's looking, because it don't matter. No one can taste the difference. So if we can see through the illusion of wine tasting, we might then be justified in opting out of the problem altogether. We can sit back passively, we can shrug our shoulders, we can throw up our hands, and we can take a play from Jesus' playbook and say, well, in the end, what does this passage really have to do with us? That's the easiest way out, by the way, and it's tempting, but I think that's why we should reject it. So let me conclude with one other possibility. At the start of the sermon, right, I told you a little about myself and about my ministry, what it is to be a chaplain in jails and hospitals. And what I said was, I think, it's my job to find the sacred in unexpected places. It's my Christian calling, let's say, to find that surprising, seemingly unknowable, paradoxical, miraculous moment when God appears in circumstances where God has no business being in the first place. And you know what? It's my hunch that it's your job too. As people of faith, we are called to move beyond, simply believing, and also called to resist the comforts of cynicism, and instead are charged with the responsibility to work just a little bit harder to find blessing in the profane, inspiration in the commonplace, and a source of meaning in what appears to us as arbitrary. See, Jesus wasn't wrong. Whether or not some wedding somewhere has run out of drinks or not has very little to do with the gospel we profess as Christians. He wasn't their bartender, and his hour had not yet come. That is all true. But the caterer found something good, something beautiful. She found the best. She found the best wine, and it wasn't because she was the smartest or the wisest or the most experienced. She was just some unnamed nobody. And in fact, it might be, or probably is, because she didn't know Jesus had anything to do with it, that she was able to find something good in a bad situation. If she had known that she was just tasting water from jars that Jesus had done something to, maybe she would have come up with a different judgment. But she didn't. Her partial knowledge, her limited experience, the specifics of who she is, her situation led her to a truth that no one else could see. No one else cares what kind of wine it is by that point in the wedding. We're told that the quality of wine just didn't matter, but when she tasted it, she got something great. And so I think the final option, the third way to go, more complicated than simply believing, more generous than going cynical, is to accept the blessing of others even if we don't see it for ourselves, or even if we don't taste it. It's common in my work for people to tell me stories and to offer their interpretations and to share them with me. People who are sick tell me God is punishing them. People who are locked up in jail tell me they are innocent. Families who have lost someone tell me their sons did not deserve to die. Women who are brutalized by their husbands tell me that they love them. And of course, people with terminal illness know that God will heal them. When I tell my friends about these kinds of revelations offered to me, the first question they ask me is, do you believe them? Do you think they're telling the truth? And I'm caught in kind of a pickle. It's hard to answer that with a simple yes or no. If I say yes, I believe them. No matter what they say, I believe them. It sounds like what I'm calling simple believing, which I think is too easy. If I say no, then it sounds like I'm being cynical, like I think everyone is a liar or incompetent. And that pushes me towards cynicism, which in my personality is even easier, and not really living into my faith. I think actually the goal is to relax my first impulse about trying to investigate how true or false someone's revelation is, but to simply be present to receive it and wonder, get curious about what kind of relational invitation is being offered in sharing this story. Rather than ask, is it true? How do you know? How can you be sure? I think a more important question is, what do you want me to know about you? What can I do with you or for you? How can I be your pastor or your friend or your ally, even if my experience is different from yours? I think it's interesting that the caterer, after finding the best wine, immediately goes and finds the couple, right? It doesn't end with a monologue. It ends with the start of a conversation. She tasted it. Oh my God, this stuff is great. And she didn't leave it there with herself. She didn't run off and start bottling it and selling it. She didn't keep that little private miracle to herself. She said, hey, you guys, come over here. Something weird just happened. You're supposed to be putting out the cheap stuff, and I drank it, and lo and behold, something I didn't expect came out of this. And I think the wisdom of the caterer is less about her judgment of the wine and more about her response to her revelation, which is to go find somebody else without understanding it and saying, hey, look at this thing that happened. I don't get it. Can I share it with you? Now, we don't know whether she meant to insult the couple, whether she was complimenting them, whether she was just making it. We don't know. But I think the amazing part is the way the story ends is by grabbing somebody else and saying, look what I just found. And I think that's the wisdom offered to us today. This is, by the way, the place where I was going to end the sermon. But on the drive up, I realized something. If you've never had the privilege of preaching, it's a great honor. But sometimes you'll be on your way to the pulpit and you'll suddenly realize, like, oh, I left something out. And I wanted to say this. It's usually easier to grab somebody and say, I just found the best. It's much more risky to grab someone and say, I found the worst. But I don't think that is worth any less of our attention. When people in this world tell you a story, maybe it's a stranger, you don't know their name, that's fine, okay? When they grab you and say, I found something strange and disturbing, it might be a story of injustice or abuse, something horrible and something in suffering. I believe we owe that person the same grace and dignity I would offer someone who found the best. Whether what they taste is sweet and delicious or bitter and foul, each person who comes to us with their story is inviting us into a relationship with them. And I believe it is our Christian duty to accept that invitation. Amen.